An old family photo uncovered a secret. They spent decades hiding from me. There are some afternoons that arrive with no warning, cloaked in ordinariness, offering no hint that they'll unravel the scaffolding of everything you thought you understood about your life. It was one such afternoon, gray-skied, lukewarm, and unhurried, when I found myself elbow-deep in moth-eaten boxes and peeling wallpaper in my grandparents' attic. The house, a worn Victorian passed down like a family heirloom, had always stood as a monument to memories I was told were too golden to touch. But now, with Nana gone and my mother reluctant to step foot in the house alone, the task of sorting things out had fallen to me. I had expected old linens, cracked porcelain, and perhaps a few yellowed letters, not the unraveling of my entire lineage. The attic had the scent of forgotten years, the stale perfume of dust, insulation, and long-dried flower arrangements. The dim light bulb flickered in reluctant cooperation, casting long shadows against old furniture draped in sheets like ghosts trapped in fabric. I moved with idle curiosity at first, tugging open boxes stuffed with holiday decor and vintage Reader's Digest until I found one that looked newer than the rest. It wasn't pristine, just less deteriorated. Taped shut haphazardly with what looked like masking tape from another decade, its label simply read Summer Lake, 1983. My parents would have just started dating around then. I didn't even know they'd gone on a trip that year, let alone one worth documenting. Inside was a stack of faded photographs curled at the corners, their colors sun-bleached and muted. They had that telltale haze of film developed cheaply at a drugstore. I smiled at first. There was my mother in denim overalls, her hair wild and sun-drenched, her face unburdened by time. My father was beside her, awkward in his stance, wearing one of those garish neon windbreakers that must have seemed stylish back then. In the background, a silver lake glittered like shattered glass, hugged by pine trees and mountains that looked vaguely familiar. Maybe we had gone there when I was little. Maybe I had forgotten. But it was the fourth photo in the stack that froze my breath mid-exhale. A group shot. 8 people sitting around a picnic table, their arms linked in casual familiarity. My parents were there, younger versions of themselves caught mid-laughter. Beside them, my grandparents, smiling broadly in a way I'd rarely seen. A few others I didn't recognize. A man with thick sideburns, a woman with large sunglasses, a young couple leaning into each other. But it was the boy seated at the very end, the boy who looked perhaps 16, maybe 17, that made my stomach contract like a fist closing, because he looked like me. Not a vague resemblance, not a passing similarity. He looked exactly like me at that age. Same angular jaw, same unruly black curls, same tired eyes that always seemed too aware of the room's tension. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the photo closer, analyzing every pixel, every detail. His shirt bore a faded logo I didn't recognize, but his posture, his smile, even the chipped tooth on his left incisor mirrored mine. My pulse quickened, a strange hollowness blooming in my chest. There was no name on the back, just the date. August 17th, 1983. I flipped through the remaining photos like a woman possessed, searching for more clues. There he was again, in a shot by the water, holding a fishing pole beside my dad. Again at the bonfire, arms crossed, eyes squinting toward the flames, and once more, blurry and distant, standing just behind my mother as she blew bubbles for what looked like someone's toddler. In every image, he was just there, on the edge, unmentioned, unlabeled, unknown. No one had ever talked about a boy. I knew my family tree with the kind of forced familiarity born from school projects and holiday dinners. It was small. My mother was an only child. My father had one estranged sister who lived in Arizona and sent Christmas cards signed only with initials. There were no cousins close to our age. Certainly no older sibling, no family friend who had lived with us or spent time vacationing together. And certainly not someone who looked as if he could have been my twin, just frozen 2 decades before me. I slid the photo into my pocket. Dinner that night with my mother felt like sitting across from a stranger I'd known my entire life. She noticed the shift, of course. How could she not? I barely touched my food. My responses were clipped. My tone, rigid with restraint. The photograph burned against my thigh like a secret trying to claw its way out of the denim. Eventually, when the silence became unbearable, I leaned back and asked, "Did you ever go to Summer Lake in the 80s? Her fork froze midair. It was subtle, so fleeting it could have passed unnoticed. But to me, it was deafening. She composed herself quickly, clearing her throat with a forced laugh. "Oh, that old place? Once or twice. Why?" "I found some photos in the attic," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Looked like a big trip. A lot of people there." She shrugged. "Probably one of those extended family barbecues your grandparents loved. They were always dragging distant relatives out to the lake." I nodded slowly, then slid the photo across the table. Her eyes dropped to the image, and I watched the color drain from her face like someone had opened a trapdoor in her soul. Her mouth parted slightly, then closed again. Her hands trembled. "Who is he?" I asked, already knowing that no lie she conjured would satisfy me. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and walked away. The next morning I drove to my father's workshop, an old converted barn where he restored antique furniture and, occasionally, his conscience. He was easier to read than my mother, less composed when caught off guard. I handed him the photo without a word. He stared for a long time. Then, in a voice soaked with exhaustion, he said, "You weren't supposed to find this." I stood still, waiting. His shoulders sank. "His name was Nathaniel," he said finally. "We called him Nate." My throat tightened. "He was your brother." The words slammed into me like a brick through stained glass. I struggled to comprehend their weight. "Was?" "He died," my father said quietly. "Before you were born. Car accident." The room shifted. The floor felt uneven beneath my feet. "And no one told me?" He looked ashamed. "It wasn't easy to talk about. Your mother took it hard. We all did. When you came along, it felt like a second chance. A new start." My mind reeled with questions. Who was he really? What had he been like? Why had his existence been erased so completely, so deliberately, that not even a whisper remained? But one question rose above all. Why didn't you ever tell me I had a brother? My father looked up at me, eyes rimmed red. "Because we wanted to protect you." From what? The truth? Or the guilt? I couldn't sleep that night, not because of the storm pounding at the windows like a restless spirit, or the cold that lingered in the old guest bedroom like a breath someone had forgotten to take. I couldn't sleep because every time I closed my eyes, the boy in the photograph, my brother, appeared behind my eyelids like an imprint burned into my subconscious. His smile, so like mine, his shoulders slumped with the same weight I had carried for years without knowing why. I felt like I had stared into a mirror from a life I never lived. And suddenly, the silence of my upbringing made perfect sense. All the empty moments in my childhood I couldn't explain. The way my mother used to pause outside what was now the storage closet. The hush that fell over the room when certain dates approached. The odd way she clutched my hand when I brought home straight A's like it was both joy and pain braided together. Those things clicked into place with a cruel kind of elegance. She hadn't just been raising me. She had been grieving someone else through me. But grief wasn't what haunted me the most. It was the deliberate forgetting. The erasure of someone who had walked this earth, shared their blood with me, maybe even paved the way for the version of me that would come after. That kind of forgetting didn't happen by accident. It required effort, coordination, and a deeply rooted shame no one had ever dared to name. I woke before dawn and drove back to the house, heart pounding like it was keeping time with every question I didn't yet have the answers to. I didn't care if it was too early. I didn't care if my parents were still asleep. I needed to know everything. And I wasn't leaving until the silence was replaced with honesty. To my surprise, my mother was already awake, sitting in the kitchen in her bathrobe, clutching a cup of coffee like it was the last anchor tethering her to this world. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed in red, but her back was straight and her expression unreadable. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You talked to your father," she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation of something she had been dreading. I nodded. "He told me his name was Nate. He said he died. He said you were trying to protect me." Her eyes dropped to the table. "We weren't protecting you," she whispered. "We were protecting ourselves." The honesty in that one sentence cracked something wide open between us. I saw my mother not as the woman who raised me, who rationed affection like it was a finite resource, who hovered over my shoulder with judgment and comparison, but as a woman who had once lived through something so unbearable, she decided to rewrite her own history rather than face it again. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked toward the hallway closet, the one I was never allowed to open growing up. She disappeared behind the door and returned with a box I'd never seen before. A shoebox, wrapped in layers of elastic bands, brittle from age. She set it on the table and looked at me, eyes hollow but unwavering. "This is what's left of Nate." With trembling fingers, I pulled the bands free and opened the box. Inside were pieces of a life I didn't know had once run parallel to mine. A worn baseball glove with his initials stitched into the wrist, a bundle of letters tied with blue yarn, a hospital bracelet dated June 14th, 1977. There was a diary with a cracked leather cover, a faded school ID card, and a cassette tape labeled in block letters, "Nate's Mix, Volume." Uchinju. I reached for the diary first, flipping it open gently, afraid it might crumble under my touch. His handwriting was messy, frantic, full of crossed-out thoughts and underlined phrases, the kind of writing that suggested someone trying desperately to understand the world around them while being overwhelmed by it at every turn. "I feel invisible in this house, like I'm just a reminder of something they don't want to deal with. Sometimes I think they wish I'd been born someone else. I tried to talk to Dad today, told him I wanted to study music. He looked disappointed, said I should focus on real opportunities. I heard them fighting again. Mom said something about the risk of it happening again. I don't know what she meant, but I don't think it was about money." The more I read, the more the pristine image of my parents began to splinter. They had buried not just Nate's memory, but who he really was. The sensitive, artistic boy who wanted to be seen. The boy who never felt like he was enough, not because he wasn't, but because no one ever told him he was. But it wasn't just sadness that settled into my bones as I read. It was suspicion. Something in those diary entries didn't add up. That line, "the risk of it happening again," echoed in my skull like a warning bell. What risk? What had happened that was so unspoken? Even decades later, it couldn't be named aloud. I looked up at my mother, whose eyes were fixed on the box like it was a coffin. "Did he really die in a car accident?" She didn't answer, not right away. Her lips parted, then closed again. Her jaw tightened, and then slowly she shook her head. "No." The silence that followed was heavy enough to smother every sound in the room. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She didn't look at me. She stared at her hands. "He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when he was 16, she said finally. "Back then it was treated differently. We didn't understand it. We didn't know how to help him. He had these episodes, highs that made him reckless, lows that made him disappear inside himself. One night he left the house, walked straight into traffic. I felt my lungs forget how to breathe. We told everyone it was a car accident," she continued, her voice brittle. "Technically it was. But the truth was, we didn't want anyone to know it wasn't just an accident. We didn't want to be that family. We thought hiding it would be easier, cleaner." I felt something crack inside me. Not just grief, but a fury laced with betrayal. "You erased him," I said, my voice trembling. "You pretended he never existed." "We didn't know what else to do," she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "We were broken. We thought silence would heal us." "But it didn't," I whispered. "It broke you more." And then it hit me. The reason I had always felt like something was missing. The reason I had always sensed an absence I couldn't name. I had been raised in the shadow of a ghost, in a house with an extra room that never had a purpose, by parents who loved me like I was a replacement, not a child. Nate wasn't just a memory. They had woven their grief into the very fabric of who I became. I stood up, the weight of the box in my arms. "I need time," I said, "to think, to process." My mother didn't argue. She just nodded, her face crumpling under the weight of truths spoken too late. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove. No destination, no map, just the open road, and the strange silence that followed revelations you wish you'd never asked for. I ended up at a motel off Route 49, the kind with buzzing neon signs and threadbare carpet. I sat on the bed and laid Nate's belongings out in front of me. His diary, his letters, the cassette tape. I stared at that tape for a long time, unsure why it felt like the most sacred artifact of all. Eventually, I found an old cassette player behind the front desk. God bless the nostalgia hoarders, and listened. And there, through the crackle and hiss of outdated technology, came my brother's voice, singing. His voice was haunting, rough around the edges but full of soul. He sang covers of songs I recognized and a few I didn't, original lyrics maybe. One of them began, "Even if I fade, I'll echo through the cracks." I cried. For him. For me. For everything they had tried to bury and everything I had finally dug up. This story wasn't over. I had found the ghost. Now I had to figure out what to do with him. The morning after I listened to Nate's voice felt like waking from a dream I hadn't realized I was dreaming. The sound of him still lived in my ears. Not just the rawness of his tone or the way certain syllables cracked with emotion, but the weight behind it, the unspoken longing, the kind of sadness you don't fully understand unless you've lived it. It wasn't just music. It was confession, veiled behind chords and fragile lyrics. I sat on the edge of that creaky motel bed for what felt like hours, staring at the cassette player like it had spoken in tongues. Like maybe if I played it again, I'd hear something I missed. A whisper in the background, a name, a code, a clue. But I didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, I opened Nate's diary again. Pages stuck together from time, smudged from age and maybe tears, his or someone else's. I flipped to the back, where loose papers were tucked between the final pages. There was one sheet folded 3 times, stained slightly at the edges. I opened it carefully, expecting a letter or a drawing. But it wasn't a letter. It was a hospital document, a form, barely legible, with the header Psychiatric Evaluation Intake, January 1978. There, in typed black ink, was something I didn't expect to see. Patient exhibited signs of trauma not consistent with bipolar episodes. Referral advised for further investigation into familial dynamics. My blood ran cold. I stared at the sentence, willing it to change, to soften, to mean something else. But the phrasing was too clinical, too precise, not consistent with bipolar episodes, familial dynamics. It was a red flag disguised in bureaucratic language. Nate hadn't just been sick. Something else had happened, something no one had ever dared to speak aloud. I needed answers, and my parents were no longer the people I could trust to give them. Not completely, not after what they had already hidden from me, what they had carefully rewritten into a story of tragic simplicity. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I dug. Back in the attic where the original photo had emerged from dust and shadows. I began combing through every box, every folder, every misplaced photo album. The light filtered through the old wooden beams in dusty streams, like memories too thick to disappear. The air was dry, filled with insulation fuzz and the musty scent of lives long forgotten. The corners of the room hadn't been disturbed in years. I pulled a battered box labeled Winter Decorations toward me, but instead of garlands or ornaments, it was stuffed with old VHS tapes, many unlabeled, others scribbled with years or family events. Christmas '88, Julia's recital, Halloween, Nate. My fingers froze on that one. I hauled an old TV with a built-in VCR up from the basement and plugged it in. It groaned to life like it hadn't been called upon in years. I slid the tape labeled Halloween. Nate inside, the plastic clicking with a sound that suddenly felt too loud in the silence. The screen crackled, then flickered into color. It was grainy, and the footage shook with the erratic movement of whoever was behind the camera. But there he was, Nate, dressed like a vampire, cape trailing behind him as he ran down the sidewalk, laughing. His laughter hit me like a punch. It was high and free, untamed, like someone who hadn't yet learned that the world was a place where your very existence could be erased. The camera panned to my mother, younger, holding a candy bucket. She was smiling, but it was a different kind of smile, one that looked practiced, forced. And then the frame shifted. Behind Nate, standing on the porch, was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark hair, wearing a wool coat that looked expensive. He was older than my father would have been then, his posture rigid, watching Nate with an intensity that didn't feel paternal. It felt possessive. My heart pounded. I rewound the tape, paused, zoomed in, as far as the old machine would let me. There was something in his gaze, not affection, Not even familiarity. It was fear. I didn't understand it. Why would someone be afraid of a child on Halloween? Why would a child's laughter trigger that expression? And then I noticed something else. When Nate turned to look behind him, when he caught a glimpse of the man, his smile faltered. Just slightly. A flicker of something I knew intimately. Recognition. Discomfort. Maybe dread. I scrambled through the other tapes. Thanksgiving 1981. Dad's birthday. Julia's dance. I loaded one after another, searching, hoping, desperate for a repeated face. And then, in a tape labeled simply Nate's 10th birthday, I saw him again. Same coat, different setting. But this time, the man was sitting at our kitchen table. I paused the tape, rewound, played it again. He raised his glass toward the camera, smiling faintly. My mother laughed at something he said. My father was not in the frame. I froze the image again, stared at it like I could reach through the screen and demand an answer. Who was he, and why did Nate look at him like that? I couldn't get the image out of my head. That night, I called the only person I hadn't yet confronted, the only one who might remember things differently. My mother's sister, Aunt Valerie. She lived a few towns over, and growing up, she was the only adult who ever treated me like I wasn't invisible. She wasn't particularly warm, but she was consistent. And when she listened, it was with an intensity that made you feel like every word you said mattered. She picked up on the second ring. Valerie, it's me, I said, trying to steady my breath. I found something. I need to ask you about Nate. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, lower, guarded. You weren't supposed to find out. My skin prickled. Then why didn't you destroy the evidence? I asked. She sighed. Because someone needed to know, eventually. I didn't have the strength to fight your parents on it. But I never agreed with what they did. I hesitated. What did they do? There was a pause. Then, you need to ask the right question. I felt the world tilt slightly. What question? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was with something that sounded like a warning. Don't ask what happened to Nate, she said. Ask why. My blood ran cold. Was he abused? I asked, voice trembling. Her silence told me everything. I whispered, was it the man in the videos? The one with the coat? A breath. Shaky. Measured. Yes. A silence stretched between us that no apology could fill. But who was he? I asked, afraid of the answer. Why was he in our house? Another pause. And then the truth fell like a blade. He was your grandfather's business partner, helped cover the family when your father's store was going bankrupt. In return, there were rumors. Nate told me things I begged your mother to believe. And she didn't? She did, Valerie said. But she also knew exposing him would mean losing everything. The money, the business, the name. So they kept it quiet, sent Nate to therapy, branded it as mental illness, and when he finally couldn't take it anymore, they buried the rest. The room spun. My family hadn't just rewritten history. They'd sacrificed a child to preserve their legacy. And I had lived in that legacy my entire life. I ended the call in silence. Back in the motel, I sat among Nate's things, the weight of history pressing down on me like the ceiling might collapse. The diary, the tape, the document, the photo. Everything suddenly made sense. The silences, the shadows, the way grief never felt like grief, it felt like guilt. And now I was the only one who knew. But the story wasn't done. Not yet. I needed to confront them. I needed them to say it out loud. I needed Nate to be more than a secret buried in the attic. I needed him to matter. The morning sunlight clawed through the motel curtains like it had no business letting me sleep in peace, streaking the room with gold and dust and a brightness that didn't match the knot in my chest. I hadn't slept. Not really. Just lay there in the dark, listening to the soft tick of the wall clock and the mechanical sigh of the old fridge, while fragments of everything I'd uncovered replayed behind my eyes like a movie on an endless loop. Except this wasn't fiction, and I couldn't change the ending, at least not yet. Valerie's voice had stayed with me through the night. Not just what she said, but how she said it. Quiet, heavy, like every word had cost her something. It was one thing to imagine that your family had secrets. It was another to know that those secrets were deliberate, chosen, and preserved through silence that spanned decades. That kind of complicity didn't come from cowardice. It came from calculation. It was protection at the cost of justice. And Nate? Nate had been the sacrifice. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees, the motel floor cold beneath my feet. The box of tapes still sat next to me, the corners frayed from being rifled through again and again. I hadn't watched them all yet. Part of me had been afraid to. But now, with what I knew, what Valerie had confirmed, I realized I didn't have the luxury of hesitation anymore. I loaded another one into the VCR. This one was unlabeled, the tape itself brittle with age. The screen stuttered for a moment, static rolling in waves, then snapped into focus. It was a living room scene, our old house. Christmas, judging by the decorations. My father sat in his recliner, unwrapping a gift, while my mother fussed with garland near the fireplace. I saw myself, just a toddler, barely walking, wobbling across the floor in footy pajamas. And then Nate entered the frame. He looked older, maybe 12, maybe 13, his hair a little longer, hanging in his eyes. He was holding a gift, still wrapped but not moving to open it, just holding it. His eyes weren't on the tree, or the gifts, or even our parents. They were fixed on the doorway. And then, as if summoned by his stare, the man appeared again, tall. That same wool coat. He stepped inside like he belonged there, like this was just another Christmas. My mother looked up, and I saw it. The hesitation, a subtle pause in her movements. Her hand froze on the garland. My father didn't look up at all. And Nate? Nate took a step back. Just one. But it was enough. I paused the tape there, the frame freezing with Nate's eyes wide and his body angled away from the man. I stared at it for a long time. Then I rewound, hit play, watched again, stepped back, pause, repeat. It was unmistakable now. He had been afraid. And still, they let the man in. Still, they played along. Still, they smiled for the camera. I ejected the tape, my hands trembling. The betrayal wasn't just in the act. It was in the aftermath. The pretending, the erasure. The way they let Nate carry the label of mentally unstable when the truth was so much darker, so much worse. They'd allowed him to drown in isolation, while the man who haunted his memories got to pour himself a glass of tea at our holiday dinners. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know. And I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel. I needed to go back, not for closure, not yet, but for confrontation. The drive back to my parents' house felt longer than usual, the roads stretched by anxiety and silence. I rehearsed what I would say in my head a dozen times, but each version dissolved into questions with no good answers. How do you accuse your parents of betraying a child? How do you ask a mother how she could stand by and let it happen? And what do you say when the person who was supposed to protect you turns out to be the architect of someone else's ruin? The house hadn't changed. Same beige siding. Same flower beds, now bare for the winter. Same wind chimes by the porch, clinking softly as I stepped onto the wooden planks. I didn't knock. I walked in. My mother was in the kitchen stirring something in a pot. She looked up, startled. "Oh, you're back early. Where's Dad?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't apologize. She wiped her hands on a towel. "In the garage, I think. Why?" I didn't answer. I just walked past her, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have in that too familiar hallway. I opened the door to the garage. There he was, hunched over his workbench, fiddling with some tool or another. He turned when he heard the door. "Hey, sport," he said with that same weary cheerfulness he always used. "Thought you were still out of town." "We need to talk." He looked at me, eyes narrowing. "About what?" "Nate." The room froze. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, like the world was waiting for his response. My father stood straighter, setting the wrench down. "We've talked about Nate." "No, you talk." I listened. "But I know now. About him, the man in the coat. Your business partner." His eyes changed then. Not panic, not confusion. Something colder. Resignation. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered," he said slowly. "But you need to let this go." "Let it go?" My voice cracked. He was abused, and you knew. A long silence. Then he said, "It was complicated." "No, it wasn't," I snapped. "It was monstrous. And you did nothing. You let him rot. You watched him spiral, and instead of helping, you buried it." He looked down at the workbench, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. "We were in debt. We needed help. Your grandfather vouched for him. And when Nate started saying things, your mother thought he was confused. She wanted to believe he was confused. And you?" He didn't answer. That was the answer. I turned without another word and walked back into the house. My mother was standing in the hallway now, clutching the towel like it could protect her. "You heard," I said. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no pity. Not now. "I didn't know at first," she whispered. "I thought he was acting out. Then, when he told me, Her voice cracked. "I didn't know what to do." "You protect your child," I said, stepping closer. "That's what you do." "I was scared," she whispered. "We would have lost everything." "You already did." The words hung in the air like smoke. I left the house without looking back. That night, I sat in my car outside the local police station. I didn't go in. Not yet. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew the consequences would be permanent. And I needed to be sure. Not about the truth, I was already sure of that, but about what I was willing to burn. The legacy, the family name, the remnants of my childhood. I thought about Nate. His laughter on that Halloween tape, his diary entries etched with desperation and pain. His music, still playing in my ears. I thought about the attic and the photo and the day everything changed. And I knew. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclamation. Nate deserved to be remembered as more than a ghost in our family's attic, and I was going to make sure of it. It was eerie, the way grief and rage could coexist like twin shadows on your back, one whispering regrets, the other pushing you forward with trembling hands. I hadn't gone home that night. Couldn't. Not after standing in the wreckage of everything I thought I knew. Not after hearing my parents' cowardice confessed like some sad bedtime story told too late. Instead, I drove for hours, aimlessly, headlights carving through the darkness while my thoughts circled like vultures over a truth too heavy to bury and too painful to carry. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nate, his retreating frame in the home video, that wide-eyed, silent plea, the way no one noticed he was breaking. The house I had grown up in didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt like a mausoleum built on secrets, each wall soaked in whispers I hadn't been allowed to hear. Eventually, I ended up at the edge of town, in the kind of diner that still smelled like 1983 and brewed coffee so bitter it could strip paint off a truck. I sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, watching the steam spiral upward like a spirit with nowhere left to go. Around me, the world spun on. Trucker caps, pie specials, neon lights flickering in defiance of their own age. Nobody looked at me. Nobody cared. And in that anonymity, I found a strange kind of sanctuary. I took out the last remaining tapes, 4 of them. I laid them on the table like playing cards, wondering if any of them held the final puzzle piece. My hands shook as I picked the next one, labeled in thick black marker, 1997, church picnic. I didn't remember going, but I also didn't trust my memories anymore. They'd been colored by curated narratives, blurred by the lies I'd been fed since childhood. I borrowed a small portable player from a pawn shop down the street, paid in cash, and watched the tape in the back seat of my car, parked beneath a flickering street lamp. It was a bright day. Children running across sunburned grass, women in wide hats arranging food on tables. I spotted myself, maybe 7 or 8, clutching a juice box and sitting cross-legged near the edge of the crowd. I looked lonely, but calm. A child used to solitude. Then the camera panned, and I saw him again. Not the man in the coat. This time it was someone else entirely. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, pale, sharp features. He wasn't participating, wasn't smiling, just lingering on the outskirts like a shadow that had slipped through the cracks. And then Nate walked up to him. The two of them stood apart from the others, talking in hushed tones. Nate's hands gestured quickly, emotionally, while the man stood frozen, face unreadable. Suddenly Nate reached out, maybe grabbing his sleeve, maybe just pleading for attention, and the man jerked away,
backing out of frame with a look I couldn't quite decode. Who was he? And why did he look familiar? I rewound the footage, this time letting it play slower, my eyes glued to the stranger's face. Something tugged at my brain, a memory just beyond reach, a name never spoken aloud, a gap in the family tree that had always been chalked up to misfortune or tragedy. I pulled out my phone and started digging, pulling up old census records, obituaries, property listings, anything that could help me tie this ghost to something concrete. That's when I found it. A mention in a decade-old church bulletin. Listed among the prayer requests for the sick and suffering, Elliot Vaughn, estranged nephew of Howard and Elise Vaughn, hospitalized for undisclosed condition. My father's nephew. I had never heard that name in my life, and that silence was loud enough to raise the dead. The next morning I drove straight to the county archives, a squat brick building that smelled like mildew and regret. I told the woman behind the desk I was working on a genealogy project and needed access to family files. She handed me a stack of folders without a second glance, and I found a quiet corner table where the sunlight slanted through warped glass and dust floated like memories still settling. I combed through birth records, baptism certificates, school transcripts. It was all there. Elliot Vaughn, born 2 years before Nate, son of my father's younger brother, Timothy Vaughn, who had apparently died in a car accident when Elliot was just a child. After that, nothing. No adoption papers, no guardianship filings, no trace of what happened to Elliot once he vanished from the record books around age 10. But I had the photo, the picnic tape, the quiet church mention, pieces of a boy who had existed and then didn't. Except he hadn't disappeared. He'd just been rewritten. Another Vaughn secret, buried under layers of shame. I confronted my father again 2 days later. He looked older this time, like the truth had aged him decades since our last conversation. Or maybe I was just seeing clearly now, no longer squinting through the fog of loyalty and longing. "Who was Elliot?" I asked. He didn't flinch, didn't pretend not to know. Just leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes locked on mine like a man preparing for execution. "My brother's boy," he said eventually. "He came to live with us for a few months when his mother had trouble, just temporary, until we could find a better place. Except he never left." His jaw tightened. "He wasn't right," my father said softly. "There was something twisted in him. You could see it even then. That's what they said about Nate, too," I snapped. "Because it's easier to label a child broken than to admit you broke them." He looked away. "There was an incident," he muttered. "Elliot, he hurt a neighbor's dog, tore it apart like it was nothing. I couldn't—" He swallowed hard. "I couldn't have that in my house, especially with Nate and you so young." "So you what?" I said. "Banished him? Buried him? Pretended he never existed?" "He was institutionalized," my father whispered. "State facility, locked away, for good reason. And you never told anyone? No one wanted to remember, not even your aunt. She drank herself to death within a year." I stared at him, my skin crawling. It wasn't just one lie. It was layers. Nate hadn't just been abused. He'd lived under the same roof with a violent, broken cousin, one the family refused to acknowledge. And when Nate started spiraling, it wasn't just because of what happened. It was because he wasn't allowed to speak about any of it. They called him troubled. They called him unstable. When the truth was, he had been the only one seeing clearly, and he was punished for it. That night I found the final tape. It was blank on the outside, no label, no markings. I almost didn't watch it. Something about it felt too intimate, too final, like opening a letter from someone you'd already buried. But I had come this far, and I owed Nate the truth. The video opened with static. Then it flickered to life. It was Nate, older, maybe 19 or 20, sitting on the edge of a bed, looking gaunt, eyes sunken, but still, somehow, possessing that quiet intensity I remembered from childhood. He held the camera himself, propped on a stack of books. "If you're watching this," he began, "then maybe someone finally decided I wasn't crazy." He laughed, bitterly. "I've tried, God knows I've tried. Therapy, medication, church. Nothing worked.
because they were treating symptoms, not causes. They kept asking me to let go of what happened, to move on. But how do you move on when no one else even acknowledges it happened? He paused, running a hand through his hair. There was a man. There was a cousin. There were nights I still wake up from screaming, and every time I tried to say something I was punished for it. I was the problem, I was the liability, not them. He leaned closer, eyes burning into the lens. I don't know how this ends. Maybe I make it out. Maybe I don't. But if you're out there, whoever finds this, don't believe their version. Don't let them bury me in silence. The screen went black. I sat in the dark, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. This wasn't just a secret, it was a sentence. And now, the question was what to do with it. There's something unnerving about silence when it's no longer peaceful, when it thickens the air like smoke from a fire long since extinguished, leaving only soot in your lungs and an acrid taste on your tongue. That was the silence that filled my car as I sat outside the hospital parking lot, hands trembling against the steering wheel, the final tape still rattling in the console like a relic from a war-torn century. Nate's voice haunted every corner of my mind, not just his words, but the finality in them, the resignation. He hadn't recorded that message as a plea. It was a eulogy, to himself, to the truth, to the family that let him rot for telling it. It was time to stop unearthing, time to confront, time to burn the rot out of the roots before it spread further. I had one name left on my list, Elliot Vaughn. He hadn't vanished entirely. Some part of me, foolish and desperate, hoped he was dead, that the monster had been locked away or buried deep beneath the cold, indifferent ground. But monsters don't die easily, especially not the ones who learn how to blend in. And after some late-night online sleuthing, cross-referencing state records and mental health institution releases, I found him. Elliot Vaughn, 54, living under a new surname, working as a groundskeeper at a Catholic seminary just 4 hours from my hometown. A real place. A real man. Still walking this earth. The next morning I drove. The seminary was cloistered behind tall iron gates, its stone architecture austere and heavy, like it had been designed to intimidate even God. I parked near a gravel path and waited. Watched. Prayed, not for strength, but for restraint. He emerged around noon, same bone structure, though time had weathered it like sandstone under a desert sun. A limp. A slight twitch in his right eye. But unmistakably him. The man from the picnic tape. The man who had torn through Nate's childhood like a forest fire and left him to smolder in the ashes. I followed him to the edge of the courtyard and stepped into his path. Elliot? He turned slowly, blinked. The recognition flickered, sharp and immediate. Not of me, but of what I carried in my expression. The weight of knowledge. The fury of memory. I'm sorry, do I know you? He said, voice calm, measured, practiced. You knew my cousin, Nate Vaughn. A pause. Then the smallest tightening around the corners of his mouth. I haven't heard that name in a long time. Because you made sure no one would hear it, I said, voice low. You did something to him, and then my family buried it, just like they buried you. His eyes darted around, calculating exits, reading danger. Not from me, but from the past I had just resurrected. I was a sick kid, he murmured, not excusing it, just telling the truth. Sick? You think that explains the trauma you carved into him? The silence that killed him from the inside out? I didn't know he was... Don't, I snapped, stepping closer. Don't you dare pretend you didn't know what you did. You might have been young, but you weren't innocent. And they, my parents, your aunt and uncle, they let you stay. They kept you while telling Nate he was the broken one. He lowered his gaze. No denial. Just the slow, inevitable collapse of a man whose sins had finally caught up. I remember, he said finally, voice barely a whisper. I remember what I did. I remember what they said after. That it would ruin everything if it got out. That Nate would bounce back. That I just needed help. So I got help. And Nate disappeared. You left him with the ghosts, while you walked away with a new name and a paycheck. Do you want an apology? He asked. Do you want blood? Because I don't have either. No, I said, stepping back. I want the truth. In your words. On camera. You're going to tell the story you helped destroy. You're going to give Nate a voice. And to my surprise, he nodded. The confession went online 2 days later. No fanfare. No sensational headlines. Just a 15-minute video uploaded anonymously, recorded in one take, the seminary garden swaying softly in the background. Elliot didn't cry. Didn't perform. He simply spoke. About Nate. About the abuse. About the cover-up that followed and the family that agreed, in silent consensus, to erase the parts of their history that didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell. And the world noticed. Comments poured in from people who'd lived their own rewritten childhoods. Survivors, siblings, silence breakers. The story didn't go viral in the explosive way scandals usually do, but it spread, organically, quietly, the way truth always does when it's finally freed from the chains of shame. As for my parents, the fallout was seismic. They called me, at first with fury, then desperation, then sobs that sounded more like bargaining. But I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. They hadn't just failed Nate. They had sacrificed him, thrown him to a wolf, and then blamed him for howling. I visited his grave that weekend, alone, with everything on the table. No more pretending. No more wondering. I brought him lilies, his favorite, according to the therapist I'd found, who had briefly worked with him years ago. I sat down in the grass, wind rustling through the trees, and read him the messages people had sent. Strangers who had seen his tape, who believed him, who grieved for him. "I'm sorry I didn't see you," I whispered. "Not really, not then. But I see you now, and so does everyone else." And maybe, just maybe, that mattered. The house eventually sold. I cleaned it out on my own, room by room, drawer by drawer, every creaking floorboard a memory, every photo a question mark. I kept only one thing from the attic, the family photo that had started it all. I framed it, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that even perfect smiles can hide fractured truths, that sometimes the most broken families are the ones that look whole from a distance. That truth doesn't always arrive in a blaze of glory, but when it does, it demands to be heard, and Nate Vaughn was finally heard. Not as a troubled boy, not as a forgotten cousin, but as the boy who knew the truth, and never stopped fighting to tell it.